This is a production of Cornell University.
You'll excuse me, I'm still a little numb from my walk across campus. I parked quite far from here, and I've just gotten off a 4-hour road trip to arrive. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Martina and Halle for inviting me, and to our horticulture colleagues for donating the slot. It's appreciated. Martina mentioned about 25 years. I've actually been at this for over 40 years in different settings. I started out as a US Peace Corps volunteer, working around water and agriculture irrigation issues in the very early 1980s in East Africa, Kenya, and Tanzania. And in that time, I was working with small farmers in a variety of different settings, dealing with a challenging environment at the time. There was very serious drought, extended, prolonged drought, leading to a lot of famine, a lot of insecurity, issues around water scarcity that I was dealing with then, which intrigued me enough to want to go back and do my PhD in the same region on farmer-managed irrigation. And I almost did the PhD here at Cornell. The only reason I didn't is because the people I wanted to work with were going on extended sabbaticals and weren't going to be available for me for about a year or possibly even longer. So I'm sure it was my loss in many respects not to come to Cornell to study here, but I was certainly inspired in my own research at that time from the work that was being done, and have continued to be so over many years. But it was a few years later that I was doing my PhD research in the same region, looking at farmer-managed irrigation systems. And I was part of a program that was managed by the World Resources Institute in Washington called From the Ground Up. And it was looking at community-based natural resource management and a whole set of different practices of local innovation around NRM. And we had a survey instrument that we were implementing in a number of different communities that was extremely long, very laborious for the researchers to carry out and to analyze. And of course, it was rather a boring and difficult process for the local people who were responding to this. Partway through the process of doing that, we had a visit from two colleagues from the UK, a gentleman named Robert Chambers and the other Gordon Conway. The first was someone who'd worked for many years around rural development policy and practice, the other around agroecosystems analysis. They were dear friends and collaborators, and they were early pioneers in what was called rapid rural appraisal and agroecosystem analysis. So they came to a room like this in Nairobi. I happened to attend with several colleagues, and they introduced those approaches, those tools and methods in that, and talked about survey slavery, the overuse of surveys in social science research, and the need to really think differently about how we engage with local people in our research processes. And we were grappling with many of the same questions that they were engaging with in places like Thailand and India, Indonesia, but nobody had really encountered some of these ideas at that point and had them presented in such clear and concise ways. That got us very excited, and we said, let's try it here. And we actually scrapped some of the survey work we were doing. We started testing these ideas. This was the early 80s, 87, 80, or late 80s, 87, 88. And we developed and adapted the approach to call it participatory rural appraisal, PRA. During that time, Robert invited me to come to IDS, still as a graduate student, to present some of those results and some of our initial thinking about that. And at that time, there was a set of discussions going on about how do we put farmers first in the agricultural research and development process, to put them more center stage in this as active partners. what I'm going to take you through is the history of that from the point of view of 3 books and some inspiring insights and ideas that Martina and Halle have kind of instigated a further thinking about how we can take some of these ideas forward by looking back at what we've learned and what we've achieved, but also what we didn't, and where we might go in future. So that's it in a nutshell. So there we are. So I'll provide an overview of 3 Farmer First books covering a period of about 20 years, describing how we were engaging in different debates over that period around these ideas of farmer participatory research. Then I'll go through and compare and contrast some of the different views and approaches to putting farmers first, how those have evolved in that period, and then take stock of some of the current political, economic, institutional context in which agricultural research and development is taking place today. Then talk a little bit about the project that Halle and Martina and I, with some other colleagues, are embarking on now, try to examine some of these participatory research and extension ideas and in national systems in different parts of the world. Be happy to take questions after that. So as I said, there were 3 books produced over a period that covered from the late 80s to the end of the noughties. And it was essentially 20 years where we were engaging across the world, really, both north and south, with partners in many different contexts, those working within the consultative group on international agricultural research, the national systems, but also a lot of NGOs, university colleagues, people in many, many different settings. The first, Farmer First; second, what we called Beyond Farmer First; and then Farmer First Revisited. The 3 of them together, as Martina mentioned, kind of elaborated the philosophical underpinnings, some of the methodological dimensions of what we've called the Farmer First approach or paradigm. These were linked to 3 international workshops that were hosted at IDS at different points and brought together over 100 scholars, practitioners from different parts of the world. So the first was Farmer First on farmer innovation and agricultural research. I mentioned my colleague Robert Chambers, now in his 90s. As of about a month ago, he said, I'm no longer responding to email. But he actually produced a book last year, so he's been quite prolific in his working life and has been, in my opinion, highly influential in the area of rural development research and planning. But he worked with a couple of other colleagues, Arnold Pacey, Lorianne Thrupp, who together edited all the proceedings from the first Farmer First conference. And really the focus was on challenging this notion of a linear view of transfer of technology from the scientists as experts to the farmers as beneficiaries, as clients, as recipients of their knowledge, wisdom, insights, and innovations. And the argument was we've got to move away from that top-down science-led approach, think much more about what we're missing from all the local knowledge and practice and innovation. How can we bring that together in a more meaningful way to respect those knowledges, those practices, those experiences of those rural producers who, of course, live in those places and know their context better than anyone. One of the key areas, and this is an area that I've focused much of my working career on, partly inspired by Robert and the Farmer First work, is what we call broadly the complex, diverse, risk-prone environments. The arid, semi-arid lands, the places, the sloping lands that are much harder to manage, where you have a lot of challenges with soil, water, nutrient management, where you have problems with productivity because of low fertility, where you have problems of getting access to markets, access to advisory services because of their remoteness in many cases, but where a lot of poor people live and continue to rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. And I continue to work in tropical drylands around the world. And so they were asking for, can we have a much more adaptive, integrated approach to agricultural research and extension in those places? So that focus on putting farmers first became that central lesson, that central focus, and it was picked up some of these insights from this book and others like it. There was parallel work going on with colleagues in other parts of the world, in Asia, in places like the Philippines, in India, very innovative work in Europe, in the Netherlands, and Germany and elsewhere, on things like participatory technology development, it was called, and participatory farmer innovation, the whole set of different approaches that were all very complementary, drawing on many of the same principles, even if they were using somewhat different methods and tools in the work. And there was this whole proliferation. It was probably the most exciting time of my career, and very honestly the most exhausting, because we didn't stop for a period of about 5 or 6 years. There was this explosion of work that was going on around farmer-led breeding, participatory crop trials, participatory soil and water conservation, participatory watershed management, integrated pest management, integrated nutrient management. All of these things were bubbling up in different quarters. People were experimenting everywhere, but always with this notion of that farmers are active partners in that research and development process, that they were central to innovation in those settings. So I'm talking a period of the 1990s now, and that's when a lot of exciting work was happening. Now, one of the things that Farmer First was stressing was that this is not an argument against agricultural science or scientists. We need those university researchers, we need those people in the international agricultural research system, but we need to think differently about the relationship between science and farmers. What we're talking about is reversing some of those power relations and changing some of those hierarchies that were quite evident in earlier periods. Now, I was not involved in that first book, but I was on the wave and was working with Robert, working with many of the other colleagues who had convened that first conference in a variety of settings. And with my colleague Ian Scoons, we were both then at the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, in London. We said, this is fantastic. We were involved in this work, but we also saw that there were some concerns about power and politics, the political economy of agricultural research and extension, that we didn't feel were really being addressed. And this comes back to some of those reversing of hierarchies, that just because we're promoting some of these participatory approaches, it doesn't mean that we're seeing a real change in the principles and in the attitudes and behavior or in the institutional structures that of agencies, universities, and others, still being very vertically oriented, very top-down, very hierarchical, and we needed to think about how we changed some of that to really make this work. So our point is, if we're going to do that, we've got to get to grips with the politics of knowledge in these different settings. So we were asking questions about whose knowledge counts, how is knowledge constructed in these encounters between farmers, researchers, and extensionists in different settings. And so the book was an attempt to extend the work of Farmer First, but it was also a challenge to many of the proponents of the Farmer First thinking, because we viewed some of the participatory work as somewhat naive, that just because people were using these new methods and tools and in a variety of settings, that we were going to see those reversals. And we were saying, no, it's not that simple. There are structural constraints that are very real that need to be addressed. And these are fundamental if we're really going to see those flips. So that was a challenge to our participatory proponents, as well as more mainstream agricultural research and development. So the central themes were drawn from the sociology of knowledge, anthropological political ecological insights into notions about agricultural knowledge and practice. And the argument was for a more nuanced, more sophisticated stance in understanding these relationships and also the arrangements, the institutional and policy arrangements around them. And again, we said this required understanding rural knowledges on their own terms, not something that people were always so comfortable with, and seeking dialogue rather than simply trying to document what farmers are already doing in their everyday practices. And notions of indigenous technical knowledge were very ITK, rural people's knowledge, very widely being discussed and described then, but still ultimately a very externally driven technocratic project that we were observing, even if it was dressed up in that language of participatory research. Some years later, Ian and I moved on from IIED. We still work with our colleagues there in London, but for a variety of reasons, we moved to the south coast of England, to Brighton, where at the University of Sussex, the Institute of Development Studies is based. He went some years before me. I followed, as Martina said, 2006. And when I arrived, I said to Ian, you know, we're looking back at 20 years nearly of all this work on farmer participatory research. Wouldn't it be interesting to take stock, to look at what's happened over this period, what worked and what didn't, and why? And so Robert also was still there with us, although in a more of an emeritus role then. So we organized a conference. Martina mentioned the Future Agricultures Consortium. That's a partnership with colleagues in about a dozen sub-Saharan African countries. We've been working on the political economy of agricultural policy in Africa for the last 20 years. And our ESRC STEP Center, which stands for Social, Technological, and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability. And that's really looking at pathways to transformative sustainability processes, not just in food and agriculture, but in a variety of domains, as we call them, health and disease, energy, and others. And so we used resources and our networks from STEPS and Future Agricultures to convene the third event. And at that time, things had moved on in the debate to focus a lot more on innovation systems in agriculture. The World Bank had been picking up on these notions. Some of the development agencies had done so, and it was decentering in some ways the role of farmers. It was taking this systems perspective to understand all these linkages, relationships, the flow of products, knowledge, resources in different forms through that agricultural system, and that included research, insights, and so on. So this is now the late 2000s when this was all going on. We used it as an opportunity to revisit some of those older debates about farmer participatory research, but also explore that wider context of ag innovation, both from a systems perspective and, as I say, from that political economy perspective, the more critical social science angle to interrogate some of the thinking of that time. And we not only were examining some of the state-led R&D efforts, but these wider networks, because the other thing that had evolved was not just the role of the state in providing agricultural extension, research support in different quarters, but also private sector actors. There was a huge proliferation then of that, and lots of talk about public-private partnerships, including in the agricultural sector. And so we wanted to examine that as part of that discussion as well. So the focus was on the politics of innovation and the way the farmers were included, or as we saw, often excluded from that. As I said, they've been decentered. They're no longer that focal point because the interest was less about what was happening on the farm, but beyond the farm gate, and looking at value chains and networks and all these other linkages and all these other actors, which is fine, but what about the role of the producers themselves? So I'm going to leave these slides with you. I don't know if Martina, you've already shared these, but please feel free to do so. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. I'll just try to touch on some highlights, because this is an extended table that was initially generated at the end of our work in Farmer First Revisited. And it was an attempt to describe some of those different eras from the 60s through the 70s and 80s, 90s, and bringing it up to the present at that time in the late 2000s. So just to focus on the first one, we were looking at the mental models of some of these activities, and going back to the beginning, it was very much that supply through a particular technological pipeline. There was a lot of in farming systems research, the surveys I described, and that overuse, I would say, of the different sorts of farm surveys and household surveys. Through the Farmer First era, this promotion of collaborative research, seeing farmers as partners, and following our discussion all around that system, bringing systems perspectives together with all of this, seeing these innovation network centered around co-development, around involving multi-stakeholder processes, often some messy partnerships in there. And then looking at farmers and their roles in this, farmers seen by the scientists themselves. In the early days, it was seeing them as they would be described in terms of, well, we have these progressive farmers who adopt our ideas and technologies. They're often the innovators, the adopters, but then there are the laggards, and they have various reasons why they won't adopt these new innovations, these new practices and technologies. And we need to enlighten them, to inform them, to show them the way, that we have our better approach. And then you have those who, in the farming systems era, was seen as objects of study, but also sources of information. Through the Farmer First era, as I said, an attempt to really see them as colleagues and collaborators, and that continued through this people-centered innovation process. A lot more focus on organized groups and collective action issues and thinking about that, and the politics of demand, we were calling it, of having them articulate what they need the scientists to be working on, not just to be having the scientists do the research and then generate that information, even if it's done with them. And then the scientists, from the farmer point of view, well, back in the transfer of technology day, they saw extension workers. They never saw the ag scientists who were often developing the new technologies and practice on station, not on the farm, so they weren't very visible. And the farming system era, they used our land. The scientists would come and do experiments, but they would essentially manage them, and then they'd ask some questions of the farmers. And during that Farmer First participatory era, they were sometimes seen as the scientists I'm talking about from the farmer point of view, friendly consumers of our time. Very nice to have a visit, but I've got to get on with other things, I've got the goats or the cows or the crops to look after. And then by this era, there are multiple sources of information, the scientists being one of many that we're getting, and that has continued to this day. This kind of fracturing of information and multiple sources available. The challenge is, how do you weigh up all that information? How do you make use of that? And who can you trust to provide you with the information and insights you need? When it came to knowledge and disciplines, often in the transfer of technology days, it was very much a single disciplinary approach, often related to plant breeding in those days. By the farming systems era, it was an attempt to be more interdisciplinary and bring in even some social sciences like economics and sociology. The interdisciplinary era followed, more about seeing farmers as experts in that environment. And then, as we were seeing it, possibly more transdisciplinary work, more holistic, more bringing together different culturally rooted knowledges and understandings and trying to meld those together in a variety of ways. And then farmer roles. In the early days, it was very much about adopting those transferred technologies, conforming to conventional practice, that Green Revolution package approach to things, then moving on to be providing information back to the scientists. They then use that in modifying their on-farm trials and so on. Then during the Farmer First era, it was very much about working to support farmers to do their own diagnoses, to do much more experimenting and testing and adapting to their context and giving them the wherewithal to allow that to happen. And then further extending that to what we were thinking, hopefully, was going to be happening of empowered co-generators of knowledge and really involved as innovators and negotiators, as I said, thinking about that politics of demand. I'm not going to go through all of these in more detail. I've got a few more yellow arrows here, but just I think I've already covered this to some extent of moving from productivity, the farm, and then beyond the farm gate. And then moving here as well, as I've described, from those technology packages all the way through to networks of innovators working together collaboratively, learning, changing, demanding support. The drivers of some of these processes moving from that supply push to a demand pull as we move in this direction. And then lastly, just to highlight one other thing, and that's about the central role of institutions and politics, of moving away from that early period of transfer of technology is that was assumed away, thinking a lot of the politics was kind of ignored here in the farming systems era, where it was just kind of a black box. It was recognized, but not really examined or understood. During that Farmer First era, and particularly as we were getting into the beyond Farmer First debates and so on, it was making it much more recognized, but there was still that concern about that naive populism. And then what we were arguing in the Farmer First Revisited period, that it was much more central to concerns, that if we're really serious about change and transformation, then we've got to get to grips with these institutional and political questions. Now, at the end of Farmer First Revisited, this is 2009 that the book came out. Robert, we asked him to write the foreword for the book, and he always had, I always found him to be very insightful and had a way with words and a good way of capturing some very complex, often extended debates. And so he wrote in the opening of Farmer First Revisited, in 20 years, more or less where we have arrived at today, if there's another Farmer First workshop, will they say in the latter 2000s, by then we could see the problems and opportunities and the directions needed for change? Or will they struggle to imagine themselves trapped in the mindsets, methods, misunderstandings, and misprescriptions that had earlier prevailed? Will they see the time of this workshop and this book as a tipping point, a watershed? And he went on to say, neither is likely in full. What happens next will depend not least on getting to grips with power, politics, relationships, and reflexivity. These have not been traditional concerns of most funders or those professionally engaged with agriculture. They're outside their normal interests and comfort zones, yet they're crucial for the transformations needed now. And he concluded, we must find new ways to engage in constructive dialogue around these themes and to map new directions for agricultural research, education, and development. So that's 2009. Now, 15 years later, wasn't quite 20, but we can take stock now and see how prescient many of those words in the Roberts preface were. We know that a great deal has changed. New shocks and stresses that have been observed from climate change to COVID pandemic have big implications for farming livelihoods, for agriculture or R&D, new economic relationships and connections, lots related to the market and trade, increasingly globalized patterns of exchange, but also fragmented linkages as well that create all sorts of problems for producers trying to sell into different markets in different settings. New patterns of urbanization and industrialization, which affects the role of agriculture in different ways as part of a wider economic and political process. And when people talk about structural transformation of economies, that sometimes agriculture, despite its importance, which I'll come back to, is somewhat ignored, even in places where it has been the foundation of much of that economy. New agricultural technologies, of course, over this period, GMOs, lots of climate smart, climate resilient crops being bred all over the world, both creating new opportunities but new risks, as we know, in terms of issues around the environment, around people's control of different products and their use. Access of those technologies, we know, is an increasing concern. As I mentioned, patterns of ownership that shift towards the private sector, and we've seen increasing concentration and consolidation of those large agri-businesses that basically are setting the terms of trade and push risk back down the chain towards the producers who have to bear some of those costs. And also in relation to the provision of global public goods. We know that during the height of the Green Revolution, there was huge investment by the state, by philanthropic organizations like Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, that actually mobilized huge amounts of public support to generate global public goods to deliver the Green Revolution, the first Green Revolution. Since then, as I say, there's been this fragmenting, this fracturing, this capturing by private actors and interests of large parts of this food system, meaning that it's much harder to generate those public goods and get them out to large numbers of producers in different ways. So we've got a complex, uncertain set of multi-scale processes, lots of interactions taking place, this intertwining of the socio-technical and agroecological dynamics at different scales, the emergence of and tensions and trade-offs between those different pathways to food system transformation. Yet a lot remains the same when we really study it hard and look at what's going on, particularly again in those complex, diverse, risk-prone environments that I mentioned earlier, that farmer-first approaches were really concentrating on to begin with. They're the ones most affected by all that climate variability and uncertainty. Oh, I better move on here. And also, agriculture remains the mainstay of livelihoods in many places for many rural people. It's also a driver of sustained employment-based economic development. So against this backdrop, we see that the R&D community continues to struggle with the narrow mindsets, restricted methods, rigid organizational structures, lots of misunderstandings and misprescriptions, as Robert called them, about the capabilities and livelihood aspirations of rural people in many ways. These reinforce dominant patterns of knowledge creation and application, and they exacerbate patterns of inequity and exclusion in the pursuit of often those silver bullet solutions, those techno fixes that we see in different places that require more nuanced, often more gender sensitive, more context specific solutions. So, farmer first again, we've had 3 of them. Is there a role for some thinking about that? The good news is we know that we've learned a lot from a lot of the bad practice, that often issues about the push to go to scale quickly with different technologies, innovations can lead to all sorts of problems. Robert called them rushed and wrong, and that can be a real issue. Yes, we need to scale. We need scalable technologies, innovations, practices, but we can get into problems. There's the constant tensions between participatory approaches driven from below and those top-down drivers, practices, institutional arrangements. We also know that there are these entrenched systemic obstacles to really farmer-centered innovation related to those institutional cultures and practices, but the individual mindsets as well. So seeing how these interlock can help us to clarify what we need to change. So that brings us to 35 years after Farmer First, and the reason I'm really here with Halle and Martina is to talk about this. We've been invited to submit a paper to the 50th anniversary of the Food Policy Journal, and our focus is really taking stock of what we've learned through that Farmer First era and draw together insights around all of that. We've got a lot of experience, so we're asking these questions. What do we know about the role of farmers in setting research priorities and shaping food policy? And to what extent have national systems and strategies institutionalized meaningful farmer participation in agriculture research and food policy processes, incorporating the principle of including farmers as co-researchers, as joint decision makers in those processes? Here's the team. You'll recognize a few of those names. I was just had the pleasure of being at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington with David Spielman, who's part of our team. And some of you may know the name Jacqueline Ashby. Jackie is one of the most influential people in this world of farmer participatory research over the last 40 years. I would put her up there with Robert as someone who's contributed immensely to the field. We have the great honor of having her as part of our team to draw on her wisdom and experience. So our objective is identify and assess the extent to which different governance and institutional arrangements have successfully helped to construct an enabling policy environment for farmers to then shape and influence public R&D agendas in different settings. We're doing this as a comparative multi-regional study. We're trying to draw together available documents, so secondary literature, combine that with some interviews of key informants, and do a narrative analysis of the changing donor landscape, of how donors have framed and responded to these issues over this last 4 decades. So we want to map the policies and processes and look at this in different countries, as I mentioned, across these 4 dimensions. And this was a contribution that Jackie made to our Farmer First Revisited workshop in 2007, looking at inclusion and empowerment of farmer organizations. I mean, not just individual farmers, but the organizations that represent them and may be able to articulate that demand to negotiate with those different actors. I'm running short of time. Strengthening the demand side of innovation systems, incorporating the accountability to farmer priorities. For me, this is a big thing that's still missing in many situations. Decentralization and what she was describing as flexibilization of farmer research and extension to accommodate that locally specific focus. So that's that top-down, bottom-up tension and the mix. And then transformation of university and college teaching curricula, an area that we've picked up quite a lot in the 3rd volume of Farmer First, which we think is really important because the next generation of researchers and extensionists are being trained in universities worldwide. Are they being informed about these ideas and approaches, or is it still the original kind of conventional, shall we say, ideas and insights? So we anticipate we'll make a contribution to the literature. I won't belabor this. And then to think a little bit more about how we can critically link Farmer First principles to now this emerging food systems transformation agenda. So things have moved on from agricultural innovation systems that I described in the late 2000s. And now the focus is very much about food system transformation and how that can go forward. There isn't a 35 years after book yet, but just to give you a sense, we think that this will be among the first that will make a contribution in the area outlined. I won't go into all the details. And we're asking, are we still putting farmers first? And if so, where and under what conditions? The first 3 volumes are available through these links. If this gets circulated to people, it's now open access, the 3 books, so you're more than welcome to download them. And as I say, this is yet to come, as it's more of an idea. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
We have 10 minutes for questions. I would, yes. Rich.
Thanks very much, and it's great to hear this overview. It brings me back to my undergrad years when Farmer First work was still very fresh. And Jackie Ashby's work really influenced my own early work in farmer participatory research. But I'm wondering, John, why the emphasis in your kind of follow-up paper on the national systems? Because we know that agricultural research. Oh, okay. Round 2. Ugh, that's really loud.
I heard all of it myself, but
There's people online?
Yeah, there's.
Okay. My question is why the focus on national systems? Because we know that agricultural research has really changed so much, and the funding in place for national agricultural research is so minuscule compared to foundation and international organizations who fund. Even if it's a national researcher, they're getting funds from outside of the national system. So that seems like the wrong place to look for the influence or not of a kind of farmer first agenda.
shall I answer this, or do you want to take a few questions first? How do you want to do it? Let me answer this one because it's a really important question, and it's a fair one. The issue, of course, is that ultimately it's national systems and national government that has a huge role to play in engaging farmers on the ground, of involving farmers in those processes. The International Agricultural Research System, the CGIAR and all, they work in small places here and there, but in terms of ongoing engagement with producers, it's national governments that have that responsibility. So that's one factor. We recognize that things are minuscule, but they also, national governments, are creating the enabling environment or not of other actors coming in and working with farmers. So we've seen over the last 25 years or so the role of NGOs. Many of them, that we can go down the list of many different groups that are working and supporting farmers in those places. But they can't operate independently. They have to work under the umbrella of the state. And increasingly, that's become more restrictive to some extent in different countries. Some NGOs actually are no longer able to work in some places. But so it's that enabling environment, understanding the role of the state in creating that context, and that includes international actors coming in and working with farmers there. We're not excluding the look at the international, and there are elements. That's why we have David Spielman from IFPRI involved. That's why we're looking at the donor debate and how that's influenced and changed things over time. So we're looking at that higher level, but our focus is understanding, well, where the rubber hits the road, where things are supposed to be operationalized at scale, are we seeing it happening in different places? Is it being institutionalized, embedded in policy and practice?
Thanks, John. Wonderful presentation. My name is Ed Mabaya, ag economist. I really like the way you integrated, almost in passing, that the new focus on systems-wide thinking. That is, especially in the light of external shocks such as COVID and climate change. There's a growing thinking there that we need to think beyond the farm gate. I'm wondering what this looks like, this farmer first approach, what that looks like in this system-wide lens where we're saying there's much more activity before the farm gate, after the farm gate, the consumer, all these other different players. Is this something that we should be replicating at other nodes, or should we still, there's still a merit to be said about really looking at the farm as kind of the ground zero where these things meet? I was wondering if you'd comment on how this will evolve in light of this system-wide thinking beyond the farm gate.
Good question, and I think there are real tensions there. As I said, even under the AIS, that Agricultural Innovation Systems thinking, when that really took off, it was explicitly stated in a number of the big strategy documents that it was about moving beyond the farm gate and decentering or moving the farmer out of the focus. The problem is that ultimately somebody's producing our food somewhere. And while everything else, all the value addition and all the system transformation and can be happening in those other places, and we need to examine all of that and understand some of those institutional and governance dimensions of those food systems. At the same time, we cannot ignore or completely neglect producers. And broadly, when I'm talking about producers, I'm not only thinking about crop producers, but livestock herders and farm workers and people who actually grow our produce worldwide. And so there is certainly a need to look at the rest of that system and understand the dynamics of change. And what are those drivers that are bringing about either system transformation that is sustainable and equitable and so on, or is actually creating more problems and externalities and the rest. All of that needs to be done. There's no question. But the concern is that the role of the producer, broadly defined, is being neglected to some extent in some of these debates. And as with the AIS discussion, once you get into that systems analysis, it can become somewhat sterile. And you can get into a lot of modeling, a lot of very good technical work, but you miss people. And you miss the role of different forms of knowledge, as we described in those earlier Farmer First discussions, the role of how that can come together effectively to produce food that is sustainable in a context which is equitable and just and so forth. So it's not either or, but our argument is let's not forget about the roots of all of this.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question is just on how much of the metrics on how effective either one of your programs is or was comes from farmers, data generated by farmers.
It's an excellent, in this particular study that we're proposing now, is that what you're asking? At this point, not a lot. But one of the reasons I'm here is to talk with these guys about the possibility of a larger, more ambitious project where that farmer engagement could be part of a really interesting multi-country study. This one is kind of a rapid piece because we're drawing largely on the secondary literature, as I described, because it's got to be produced for a journal and there's a deadline. It's relatively short. So it is a rapid review, taking stock, but also I would hope that it will generate questions and point to issues that we can then take to the field and work with our partners there and their farmer colleagues to explore those issues. That's where I would like to take this ultimately.
There's one question online.
Manushi Trivedi says, very exciting talk. Thank you so much. Would you be able to give one example of scale too quickly techno fails and one case study from the US, if you have it?
case from the US. I'm not sure, I'll have to think about the latter, on that same issue, I guess. Oh, no, use case.
Oh,
Use case. Let's see, yes, I can give you an example. I hope my dear colleague doesn't get upset by this. Some years ago, I had been working across sub-Saharan Africa with some of the international agricultural research institutions, the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, what was then called ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Center, and a variety of national systems around agroforestry, participatory agroforestry issues, and what was called alley farming. And alley farming was a big deal for a while in the CGIAR. It was being promoted widely. And the idea was to have what they called multi-purpose tree species. And these were wonder trees that were developed and tested on the stations of IITA and several other research centers in different parts of the world. And they did exactly what the scientists thought they would do. They were very rapidly growing. They were able to produce green manure, green fertilizer. They could grow poles and fuel wood. They were used for animal fodder. They did all sorts of fantastic things. And we were involved in supporting a whole farmer participatory engagement process. But it became, when we did the training with the scientists, we said we really need to consult with the farmers to see, is this something you want and need, would work for you? And let's hear more about what you're already doing through this process. To be fair to the colleagues who were promoting this from the farmer side, they got what we were talking about. The scientists who were promoting the trees and developing the different varieties, they were just keen to get these out to as many producers as possible. The thing came to a head in Nigeria, where we did a regional training. We brought a group of Anglophone and Francophone farmers together from across the region for a 2-week training. And there was a lot of concern about this push to get these multi-purpose tree species out, because they'd heard some concerns from the farmers that they were not what they needed, and they were very difficult to manage, that they actually they took over farms. They grew so quickly that farmers didn't have the labor to manage the crops and manage these trees. And so they became pests in those fields. Now, there was a big debate at that time and resistance from some of the scientists, until we took a group of colleagues from Benin, who also were Yoruba speakers, and IATA is in the southwest of Nigeria, which is Yoruba land. And we went out to speak with a group of local farmers in those environments. And we met the gentleman who was the star alley farmer. He was on the cover of the annual report of IITA. He's had the most perfect alleys that were right along the roadside, and they would bring dignitaries from around the world to see his perfectly managed farm. And the Benin colleagues got there, and they were talking and interviewing him. His neighbor was there, and they're saying, tell us more about this. And this man was just waxing enthusiastic of, these are the most wonderful trees. They do everything that the scientists claim. And his neighbor said to him in his local language there, you're full of nonsense. You know, your real farm looks nothing like these alleys. And our colleagues from Benin overheard this. They went into the bush more and actually looked at where he was growing most of his produce, and it looked like every other West African farm. There wasn't a straight line anywhere. It was all mixed cropping. He was doing all the usual practices there, and he had his trees in different locations that he could manage. But this is 10 years of work, this push to get these multi-purpose tree species out there. And that was, I'm not saying alley farming is wrong. I'm saying this push to go to scale was the problem. And it then led to a real contraction and ultimately a defunding of that program. But it was a simple salutary lesson of talking with a gentleman who wanted to, be in the good books of IATA and keep all those scientists happy. But the reality was he wasn't practicing what they were preaching because nobody engaged with him to ask him about his knowledge and his real practices and real priorities.
Yeah. Well, thanks. We are slightly over time, so thanks very much.
You're welcome.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.